So welcome back everybody to this short series of modules for the Primary Care Network Development Programme. And as you know, we're now at module 5, having looked together at building your personal presence, influencing for change, giving and receiving feedback and managing through resistance. And of course, nestling throughout all of those is the fact that none of them can happen without conversations. So today, we're going to be looking at handling challenging conversations, the conversations that you might well be putting off and how best to approach them. And then next time we meet on the 15th of June, leading for personal well-being, finishing with a focus on managing time and workload. So let's begin by thinking about the importance of conversations. The truth is, of course, that nothing happens without conversations, and often one of the most important and discernible aspects of moving into leadership is the fact that the product becomes a conversation or a report rather than some tangible, practical action. So I think recognizing the significance of being able to handle conversations as well as we possibly can is fundamental to transitioning into leadership. In fact, there are some schools of thought that think about leadership as being effective one conversation at a time, which makes leadership development and improving leadership effectiveness actually very accessible. If you think about every conversation providing an opportunity for you to intentionally manage yourself well and achieve the outcome that you want to achieve as near as you possibly can. And looking more broadly, there are writers that think of culture as being comprised of a series of conversations and who suggest that you really only know if the culture of an organization is changing when who you talk to, about what, how frequently, and how you speak begins to change. So if you're interested in that perspective, the work of Patricia Shaw, Changing Conversations in Organizations is the name of the book, is particularly interesting and useful. And I guess one of the things that we know is that there are particular moments or aspects or themes around challenging conversations. So as you're moving yourself into the territory of this short module, maybe think about which of these are true for you, which are the kinds of conversations that you find the most challenging. Are they the kinds of conversations on the right of your screen, handling expectations, where you need to give clear guidance about what needs to happen, articulate goals that are specific, describe standards that need to be maintained, make sure that you're clear enough about the degree of freedom or discretion that colleagues have to take action within. All of that is around managing expectations. And for some of us, those are the most challenging conversations. It's also true that offering support can be challenging. How much, which approach, to whom, how frequently, are all aspects of leadership effectiveness that we need to navigate. So whether or not you approach support by offering guidance, by using a coaching style, by offering instruction, these are all part and parcel of the decisions that you need to make. And often, very frequently in fact, the most avoided challenging conversation is the feedback conversation, particularly where you might need to be offering feedback that the other person is unaware of. Now, of course, most of us tend to think that that's developmental or constructive feedback, but it could equally be positive and appreciative feedback if we're not comfortable being that indulgent in our approach. So just as a very simple starter framework, maybe just notice, is there a pattern for you in the kinds of conversations that you find more challenging? Because simply knowing the species of conversation that you find more challenging than others is a really helpful starting point, given that once you know that in the future, when you recognize that you have a conversation of that nature coming up on your timetable, that you need to steady yourself, to ready yourself, to prepare yourself well. And that leads me to ask you to do a little bit of thinking now, maybe pause the video to identify the conversation that you want to have in mind as we're talking through the approach that you might take in this short module. And it's very helpful to think that through in relation to these 3 bullet points. So the first question, what's your conversation about? With whom? A group, an individual, a particular group of colleagues even may be possible. And maybe most importantly, to achieve what? What's the outcome that you're after? Very frequently, we wait too long to have challenging conversations. And actually what we're looking for is some kind of catharsis or relief. Of course, it's very important to think, what's the difference that I want this conversation to make? And how will I notice whether or not this conversation is making that kind of difference? So I'm going to continue recording the module now, but I'd really suggest that you might pause the play and just think this through so that everything to come is related to the conversation that you want to be handling. So let's have a look together at what makes this kind of conversation, challenging conversations, difficult. And there are usually these factors at play. And again, please identify for you which of these, if any, are particularly significant and real. So don't have time to prepare, don't have time for the conversation. Actually, I'm going to give you a structure which I hope you'll see takes very little time to prepare and makes a fundamental difference to the way that you might be able to manage and navigate the territory of a challenging conversation well. Differences between people, of course, one of the reasons that conversations are challenging is because the relationship between you and another person is challenged. And quite frequently, the reason that we find a person difficult is not because they necessarily are difficult in their own objective way, but actually that we find the differences difficult. And of course, there are many different frameworks that we might be aware of that help us navigate and map the territory of difference. But you know, one that's actually quite useful is to think about the 5 fundamental differences between personality types, which produces an acronym called OCEAN, where O stands for differences in openness, C in conscientiousness, dependability and reliability is what's meant there. E, extroversion or introversion, whether or not people are extroverted and only know what they think when they hear themselves saying it, and introverted rather more that they need to be their own audience, their own thoughtful audience to begin with before they offer their opinion externally. A, agreeableness, whether or not somebody likes to be compliant or maybe slightly rebellious. And N, neuroticism, which essentially is the degree of emotionality that you might meet in a person. So moving on from that, another difference that we might identify, which is fundamental, is power differentials. Because of course, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that if what we're doing is having a challenging conversation with somebody more senior to us, then we want to navigate it in a way that isn't, how can I put this, career limiting. But similarly, actually, one of the things that's very important is that we manage conversations with people who have less power than we do in a way that enables them to speak truth to our power. One of the things that I think we very, very rarely appreciate is how our own power might reduce our colleagues' openness with us. And a conversation is only successful if it's as open as can be helpful. It's also true, though, that no conversation exists in a vacuum, does it? And if you need to have a sensitive conversation and there are other stakeholders that may well become involved, then you need to do your due diligence on thinking about the kind of support that you might need. You having a discussion with X might be undermined by your more senior colleague Y if X goes to Y to maybe have a discussion about the appropriateness or inappropriateness of the discussion that you've just had with them. So it's very important to think systemically about your conversations and think carefully about where you might need to get support from. You yourself might not want to be seen as difficult in being challenging or having a challenging conversation. You might see yourself as a helpful colleague, somebody who's diplomatic and collaborative, so not want to be seen as confrontational. And of course, that can be inhibiting. Some thoughts on that later. I think, though, that the two main things that tend to get in the way of the two final bullet points are lack of confidence in how we might handle another person's emotional reaction to what we say. And of course, maybe also the truth is managing our own emotion in the face of needing to handle a challenging conversation. So please be thinking which of these aspects, if any, you recognise and you relate to, because actually this may well be how you build your confidence in having these challenging conversations, to pay attention to and to take action on whichever, if any, of these you relate to. And just to remind you of something we've spoken about earlier in one of our modules, what of course the idea of challenge brings to mind is that there is likely to be new information offered in a challenging conversation. And some of that information is going to land in people's blind spots, things that you know about them that they don't know about themselves, their impact, their significance, their effect on other people. And so to bear in mind that we might be talking to somebody about something that they're less aware of and more sensitive to is a really important framework to factor in. It's also true, of course, that the feedback that you get or the reaction that you get in the conversation might well land in your blind spot, which of course is a reason that challenging conversations are so much to do with emotional regulation and emotional intelligence. So what does that mean is helpful for you to think about in planning for a challenging conversation? I think three things. Again, I'm going to just talk them through and then suggest that you might like to pause this recording to think about the implications for you around the conversation that you have in mind. So who do you need to seek support from before you have the conversation? As I mentioned earlier, what you don't want to see happen is the person that you're having this conversation with complain about the fact that you have with somebody senior to you and them then undermine you. So it's always worth your while, if this is relevant, going to a more senior colleague, saying that you're planning to have this conversation and asking for their support or for their guidance or for their sponsorship even in the conversation that you're planning. The next point might be less than clear. So knowing what your crumple button is. Crumple button is a little bit like being psychologically winded. I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience of discomfort of being physically winded, where you lose your breath and you stumble for a while and you can't get back to balance again. Crumple button is the emotional variation of this. So is it somebody's tears? Is it somebody's anger? Is it somebody's silence? Is it somebody's passivity that might trigger you to lose your focus and become distracted, so that you become less confident than you might want to be, less focused than you might want to be? So know your crumple button, because what's instinctive to our colleagues is to know our crumple button. And there's a tendency for it to be pressed just at the point that you need to maintain your emotional resolve. And the third thing that's really important is to really understand what gives you the right and responsibility to have this conversation. Because if you don't have confidence in it being appropriate for you to hold this conversation, then that will cause you to feel slightly less certain, and that hesitancy may well undermine your ability to handle the conversation as well as you might like to. So after having thought about this, a couple of reminders, really important starting points. One is we often prepare the content of what we want to say, but we don't prepare our mood and our intention. And probably those two things matter more than anything else. If we have a clear intention, we can navigate the conversation even through a change in or an unexpected redirection. We can ebb and flow with the mood and the reaction, but without a clear intention, without a clear outcome in mind, we can be buffered. And if we're not managing our state so that we focused on keeping ourselves grounded and keeping ourselves confident and focused, then actually what can happen is that we can become blaming or punitive even, or self-diminishing or too modest or lacking in appropriate assertion. So preparing your intention and your state of mind matter as much, if not more, than the content. So a couple of things as guidelines here. The first is, what is your intention? Going back to that early point on outcome. And the importance of distinguish between a conversation and a case, or a conversation and a condemnation, is really significant here. Recognizing that a conversation has a natural flow to it, which I'll come to in a moment, whereas stating your case is really advocating for your interest, or your position rather than seeking to open up some kind of mutual discussion about the issue. And of course, both of those two, particularly the last point, means that it's important to recognize that you will need to manage your own emotions, maybe your own defensiveness, through the course of the challenging discussion. And that might be as much of the work as holding steady on your focus and holding steady on your intention. So a natural conversation, if it's not challenging, we recognize has a flow to it. We offer an opinion, we inform, that opinion then invites another person's perspective, which we listen to and we acknowledge, and we factor that in to the next iteration of offer and receive. That then informs the way forward. Where this tends to break down when the conversation is challenging is that we tend to inform without inviting and listening, and then that produces a lack of acknowledgement that can produce conflict rather than conversation. So a great way into this is to not prepare for the whole of the conversation, but prepare for the first couple of minutes, or maybe even less than that. Because once you've set the tone, once you've clarified the intention, once you've settled into the discussion and managed the mood, then it's much easier to stay focused on your intention and your state. So I'm going to introduce you to a framework which is offered by many expert facilitators who work as mediators and manage challenging conversations. And this framework of 7 steps helps hold us steady. So begin with warmth and confidence. Be clear about the issue and name it. Give a specific example. Explain the impact on what you believe to be at stake. Acknowledge how you may have contributed to the issue. Indicate that you want to resolve the issue, the constructive intent that you bring, and then invite a response. So just as an example, choosing something fairly innocuous, you might say, really appreciate having the opportunity to meet you, Ken. The conversation that I want to have is about the fact I've noticed you've been late 3 times for shift. And those 3 occasions have really had an impact on me and on colleagues in the team, because as you'll understand, we have to pick up your work. And it is something that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about it for the team, and for patient care, but I'm also concerned about it for you because I know that this is unusual for you. So I recognise I should have and maybe could have mentioned this earlier rather than notice 3 times. It probably would have been more helpful for us to have had a conversation after the first time. And I hope, though, that you know I'm having this conversation because I recognise that it's important that we find a way forward with this, and I need to understand what might be behind this pattern for you. So let's talk about that. What are your thoughts on what I'm saying? That's an example, maybe clumsy, but an example of what I suspect was probably about 60 seconds, which says a lot in a short period of time, but actually it sets the territory for the conversation. So now, before doing anything else, I'd like to ask you to pause the video and to have a go at articulating this for yourself. Now, that might mean that you spend 5 minutes or so just preparing, making a few notes rather than a script. I'd suggest a few notes, and then practicing out loud, maybe even recording yourself actually, so you can see how you manage the message. And then we'll debrief this and think what might be helpful going forward. So welcome back. And a couple of things that might strike you in that. One is how important it is to have the conversation at the bottom of what Chris Argyris calls the ladder of inference. And what he's describing here is the way in which we wait too long to have a conversation. We take the possible data and we notice and we judge and we make up a story and then we decide how to act. So important when you're starting a conversation to offer specific and objective, observable information so that it's not nuanced or tainted by your translation and your judgment. So start with the facts is a really important way forward. And then managing the emotion. I think a couple of things here. One is the importance of expecting to meet emotion and to feel emotion rather than look for ways to prevent it. It's possible, even in a challenging conversation, to use an adjournment as we might in a negotiation. And obviously we wouldn't use that language, but you might say something like, okay, I think it's a good time now for us to pause the conversation so we can both spend a bit of time thinking about what we've said and what we've heard. And that just gives you an opportunity to gather yourself. Really important here, isn't it, to balance being firm with the issue and fair with the person. So you might want to be very rigorous about the lateness with Ken, but also warm and respectful of the person. Too frequently, we conflate those two things and end up being rather too rigorous with the person so that we create more of a defensive reaction. Staying curious, how might your colleague be right in anything they say to you, particularly if any part of what's happening for them is related to your impact on them. So things here that will be really helpful. Managing defensiveness on their or your part by allowing that time to digest, the adjournment maybe that I suggested earlier. The managing any upset, particularly in the other person, with empathy and rigor. For example, in the face of tears, you might say, no, I can see that this is a difficult conversation and that you're tearful. We do need to continue the conversation. Let's have a pause now so that you have an opportunity to take stock of where we are. And you might manage, for example, anger with a similar calm acknowledgement without being rocked by it, but recognizing that if we're in the Jihari blind spot, it's quite likely that people will need a little bit of time to just process the information that you've given them. So I can see that this is new and difficult, and we do need to continue the conversation. So what's the best approach to us doing that? I think if we pause now, let's meet in half an hour's time in order that we can refocus in a way that will be constructive for both of us. So I hope this short film has given you food for thought. Handling challenging conversations can release energy and create real movement. And if we avoid those conversations, it's frequently the case that relationships are damaged and patient care suffers because standards are diminished. So I wish you well in handling these conversations and look forward to talking with you next time about leading for personal well-being. Thanks so much for your time today, and I hope this has been useful.